All right, so as I said last time, we now have a way of getting these boxes together. And this time we're going to talk a little bit about avoiding the train car phenomenon. That is, you have a block, and it's followed by a block, and it's followed by a block. If you don't do any CSS styling at all, that's the natural way for a web page to lay out. You provide it in a set of blocks, and it lays it out in a set of blocks. This is often referred to as the flow. That is, it's kind of like, again, I wish it were the other way around, but think about if gravity were inversed and you filled up a bucket from the bottom. You fill, as you go through the HTML, all this stuff kind of just flows up to the top, kind of floats upwards, going up to the top to fill up that bucket. Now, if you want to have more than one of these things in the bucket side by side, there's a couple things you have to do. First, you have to set up a line. That's what the width is for, and say, okay, here's the edge of this. I'm not going to let it just spill out and fill out completely outside. And then you have to let it know that you're willing to let things go in beside. That is, you're going to take this piece, this box that you've limited the width of, and you're going to move it outside the flow. You say, okay, we're just going to take it aside, and you can let things flow around it, but it's going to be outside the flow. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to take a couple of chunks of the text, and we're going to move it outside the flow. To do that, let's take a look at the page, and I'm just going to shrink it way down here. I'm just in the browser here. This is all I'm doing is I'm zooming out in the browser. Control minus, I think almost in all browsers these days does that. All right, that's as far back as I can go. Now I'm going to take a look here, and you'll see that you've got a whole bunch of text, and this is going all the way across only because there's no restriction on it, and because I'm zoomed way, way out. And then at the bottom we've got the side elements, and really what I want is to have all this stuff on the left and all this stuff on the right. So how do I do that? Well, first of all, I'm going to need to decide how wide I want to go. I'm going to be very, very conservative here and say 780 pixels. That is for really, that'll capture, I think, something like 98% of web viewers now. Even my phone goes at 800 pixels wide. 780 leaves an extra 20 pixels over here on the side for the bar. So we'll take a look in a minute. This is actually, we're viewing this at 1280. So that's limiting ourselves to 780 is fairly conservative. But that's what we'll do. So let's just say in our heads, normally we would do this on paper, and I cannot urge you strongly enough to do this on paper when you're laying out a page. We're talking about 780 wide. Let's say that this part is going to take up, say, with everything, all the spacing and everything else, 400 pixels. So the first thing we need to do is set this up as 4 pixels. Well, what is all this stuff? That's easier asked than answered. We can take a look. We've got a container here. And the container is actually everything you see on the page. It's fairly common these days, and it's convenient. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to show you an example of this, but whenever I create a website, I usually do put everything in the site in a big div called container, because it gives me a lot of flexibility in terms of laying things out and changing it later on. So even if I don't have a specific reason to, I often put things in a container. But then we've got this section, which is the intro section, the supporting text, and then down here we've got the link text, the part that we want to be floating over off onto the right-hand side. So the first thing we need to do is make room for this to go over to the right-hand side. There really isn't room over there for it. So we've said we want these sections to be 400 wide. How do we do that? Well, we've got a div called intro, a div called supporting text. Those are the two we want to be on the left-hand side. So let's go ahead and limit the width of those. Remember, it's an ID, so we do this. And the first one is intro. And I'm going to do comma, supporting text. Now, what does that comma mean? It means that what I'm going to say here in terms of rules applies equally to both these things. So we saw this before with h1, h2, h3. Here I'm saying the things I'm going to do in here applies equally to both of these. So the first thing I'm going to do is, just for convenience sake, go ahead and put a border on them so we can see them and know what exactly it is that we're addressing. So I'm just going to do a 1 pixel solid, and you'll see we've got a border right around here. This is one of the boxes we're going to be addressing, and then this is the other box we're going to be addressing. Okay? And so those are the two that we've selected using that rule. We'll go back, and the main thing we're going to do here is we're going to set up a limit to how wide they can go. And we said we were going to do, I think, 400 pixels. that we've limited things a lot. And they're way over here now. Now again, if we went back to kind of a normal zoom, view, zoom, reset, this is the way it would be in normal zoom. So we have definitely shrunk it up over to the left-hand side there, but it's not as extreme as when we were zoomed out. So we've limited the width, but this stuff down here is still down here. And so what we need to do is to do more than just limit it. We need to take it out of the flow. So what we're going to do is we're going to say float left. Aha! Now what's going on here? We've actually made it 3 columns. How is that the case? Well, it's because these 3 fit. So for example, we have, as I said, about 12. If I went all the way to the outside here, we have 1280. So what we've said is that this one can float left and the rest of the stuff can go by it. This one also, we've said, can float left, so there's room here to go to a third. All right. If this were smaller, now there's only room for this to go in there and it has to drop back down here for the next piece. If this were smaller still, this one can fit, but the other one can't because it's a full 300 wide. So it drops down here. So that's not exactly what we wanted to happen, but it's getting much, much closer, right? So the natural question is, what are we going to do to fix this? We've got these 3 across. Now, I'll note real quick that when it's small enough, it kind of works. Why don't we take a look and see how someone else has solved it? Is this cheating? No. Laziness is a virtue. We want to be able to reuse it. And in fact, if we go to Zen Garden, we saw something that was kind of doing what we wanted to do. And kind of one of the official designs that we saw towards the beginning was called Oceanscape. And here they've done pretty much what we wanted to do. They've got the intro over here on the left, and the discussion over here, the specifications over here on the left, and then a right column. And no matter how wide it goes, it still seems to be okay. And you'll see that it kind of, if you go too small, it kind of moves over, but if you go wide enough, it still stays that way. It doesn't fill in. So how is it that they're doing that? Well, let's take a look at remember, they're using the same HTML we are. So let's take a look at their sections. If we take a look at the intro, okay, they haven't chosen 400, but it's close. They've chosen 356, and they've floated it to the left. That's exactly what we did. So if you look at container here, you'll see that it's 200 pixels from the top, and auto, which basically makes it center, at least on some browsers. So that's centering the container. But most important of all, we've restricted the total width of this container. So no matter how much you spread out the browser itself, the container will never change its width from 536 pixels wide. So we could never shove in 2 400 pixel wide sections because there's just not room for it. So let's see if we can do that ourselves. We'll go ahead and add in a section for container. Let's see what that does to it. Just to review it real quickly, it's 700 pixels wide, which means that only one of these units is going to fit in there, although there will be room to put in this. And the margins are automatic. So that means auto doesn't really mean much for top and bottom, but for left-right it should center it, at least on Firefox. Alright, so we've got it over here on the left. We do have an issue here with it ending up in the middle, and there are a couple of ways to fix this. Good ways and bad ways. We're short on time for this unit, so I don't want to kind of shortchange it and say leave it as an exercise to the reader. I will say if you want to do it quickly, one way is to set up what they've done on theirs and do absolute positioning, and then do a margin off to the left so that it's not overwriting the section that we've floated. That's one way to do it. I prefer to stay away from absolute positioning for a bunch of different reasons. You could do a negative top margin, which is also probably a bad idea because it can get messy across browsers. But rather than getting into the complexities of that, we at least have that bar over to the left. Oh, the other thing we could do, which is probably the best solution of all, is to put everything on the left-hand side in its own div. Although they put lots of divs in there, the challenge here was not to change the HTML. And this might be an example of where it would make sense to change the HTML and put